Welcome to another deep dive. Um, Today we're going to be talking about how we as humans interpret information, make judgments, and just how tricky it can be to deal with complex systems. Especially when we're under pressure. We're going to be talking about all this through the lens of uh, mainly Malcolm Gladwell's book, What the Dog Saw, right? With a focus on the parts about intelligence analysis, medical diagnosis, and what it even means to be an expert. Ready?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so when I was reading this book, the thing that kind of jumped out at me first was this idea of mystery paradigm. It sounds, I don't know, kind of scary, but it's actually a pretty useful way to think about the world.
Right. And it was really the political scientist Alexander George, I think, who brought this idea to light. He was looking at, propaganda analysis during World War II, and he noticed this shift, how we approach problems. It used to be all about solving puzzles, right? Like a Sudoku or a crossword puzzle, things with clear-cut solutions. But increasingly, we're having to deal with mysteries. So things that are a lot more, well, ambiguous, I guess, where the answers are more about probabilities than, absolute certainty.
So less like, I don't know, Sherlock Holmes, and more like trying to predict the stock market, maybe.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And the shift, you see it everywhere, even in fields we think of as, super precise, like medicine. Take prostate cancer diagnosis. It used to be just a physical exam, pretty straightforward. Now you've got PSA tests, ultrasounds, biopsies, all this technology. So much data. But here's the thing, the data isn't always like crystal clear.
Right, you hear all the time about like elevated PSA levels, but it doesn't necessarily mean cancer. And even biopsies, like they're not 100%, are they?
Nope, not at all. And that's where the whole mystery paradigm really kicks in. We've got all this information, but it doesn't like add up to one answer. We have to weigh probabilities, make judgments based on, incomplete data, and accept that there's always going to be some uncertainty.
And I think that's something we can all relate to, especially nowadays, right? I mean, we're bombarded with information from every direction,
Yeah.
constantly. And it seems like the more information we have, the less sure we are about, well, anything.
It's a real paradox, isn't it?
Totally. Which brings us to another thing Gladwell talks about, the power of pictures. I don't know, it's like we're programmed to believe that seeing is believing. Like
Yeah.
pictures capture, reality itself.
Absolutely. I mean, think about those old photos of, what's his name? Edward Muybridge, the ones of the horse running. Those pictures, they changed how we thought about, how animals move. They proved that what we thought we knew was totally wrong. Pictures can be really powerful, revealing things we wouldn't see otherwise.
But they don't always tell the whole story.
Right, right. And mammography is the perfect example. Here's this technology, right? It gives us a picture, literally, of what's going on inside the body. But even that doesn't always give us, a clear answer.
I mean, it's not just about seeing, like, a lump or a shadow, right? There's got to be all sorts of stuff that goes into, like, reading a mammogram.
Oh, yeah, tons of factors. Dr. David Dershaw, he's a breast imaging specialist. He talks about different types of calcifications, for example. Some are harmless, some might be cancerous, and then there are a lot that are, somewhere in between. Even telling the difference between a benign lump and a malignant tumor can be tricky, especially if there's a lot of dense breast tissue.
So it sounds like there's a lot of interpretation going on, even with something like, a medical image. It's not as objective as you'd think, maybe.
It's really interesting, right? And Dershaw even says that a radiologist's personality can affect how they interpret a mammogram. Some are more cautious naturally. Others are like more likely to see something suspicious, even if it's not there. And there's actually research on this. Joanne Elmore, she had 10 different radiologists look at the same 150 mammograms, and their interpretations, they were all over the place.
Really? I mean, how much variation are we talking about here?
Well, one radiologist, they caught something like 85% of the cancers. Another one, only like 37%. That's a huge gap. And it shows you that even with a picture, there's still so much, interpretation involved, so much human judgment.
Wow, it's a little unsettling to think about, to be honest. And it actually reminds me of another concept from the book, the Schwein problem.
Ah, yes. That's a perfect example of how things don't always go as planned, even when you have, a clear picture and execute everything perfectly. Gladwell uses the World War II bombing of those ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. Remember that?
Yeah, I remember reading about it. Remind me, what exactly happened?
So the Allies, their goal was to, cripple German war production. And they had these amazing aerial photographs, really detailed. They could pinpoint the factories, no problem. And the bombing raids were super precise, direct hits, right on target. But get this, the bombing, it barely even slowed down German production.
Really? Why not?
Yeah.
Did they underestimate how many factories there were, or?
No, not at all. It turns out that the pictures, well, they didn't tell the whole story. The Germans, they had stockpiles of these ball bearings, they had backup sources, and they were really good at adapting their designs quickly. So even though the Allies had, technically achieved their objective, hitting the factories, they totally missed the bigger picture, the context, surrounding those targets.
So they solved the puzzle, I guess, of how to hit the target, but they completely missed the mystery of what that target really meant.
Exactly. And that Schmein problem, it's not just some old war story. It's super relevant today, especially with, modern warfare.
Yeah, I can see that. How so?
Well, think about how precise bombing is now. We can hit specific rooms and buildings, incredible accuracy. But the problem is, how do you know for sure what's in those rooms? There were all those airstrikes aimed at Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Every single one failed because he wasn't actually there.
It just goes to show that technology, it can give us this incredibly clear picture. But understanding what that picture means, the context, that's what's really crucial. It's like having a high-definition map, but you don't know how to read it, I guess.
Perfect analogy. And this brings us to, intelligence analysis, where the challenge of connecting the dots is even more crucial and maybe even more dangerous.
Oh, yeah. This is, I'm really fascinated by this. I bet our listeners are too.
Oh,
Let's dive into that world next time. Okay, so we were talking about how hard it can be to make sense of information and make good judgments, especially with those complicated systems. And I can't think of a better example than the world of intelligence analysis. Can you?
It's a tough job, that's for sure. I mean, the stakes are huge, the pressure's intense. These analysts, they're sifting through mountains of data, right? Trying to find patterns, connect the dots, and anticipate, things that could have devastating consequences. It's a lot.
And it's not just about having the info. It's making sense of it, right? It's like having all the puzzle pieces, but still not seeing the whole picture.
Exactly. And one of the most striking examples, I think, is the Yom Kippur War. Israel, they had a ton of intelligence, right, pointing to the fact that Egypt and Syria were planning this attack, a coordinated attack, troop movements, intercepted messages. They even saw the Soviets pulling their families out of the region. But even with all these warning signs, they just didn't grasp how serious it was, how big the attack was going to be.
I mean, come on. How do you miss those kinds of signals? What happened there?
Well, part of it is just the sheer volume of information, intelligence agencies have to deal with. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Except the haystack keeps growing and it changes shape all the time.
Right, and then there's the bias problem too, isn't there? Like we tend to see what we expect to see, or maybe what we want to see.
Oh, absolutely. It's called creeping determinism. That's what psychologists call it anyway. It's that, that tendency to look back and think past events were more predictable than they actually were. It's like when something happens, you think, oh, well, duh, of course it was going to happen. But the truth is, it's usually not that obvious.
Totally. It's like when some celebrity couple breaks up, right? And you're like, well, they were never going to last. But did you actually predict it beforehand? Probably not.
Exactly. And intelligence analysts, well, they're kind of set up to fall for those biases, because they're always digging through data, trying to make sense of it. After an event happens, it's easy to see all the signs pointing to it, even if those signs weren't so clear at the time.
Which, of course, brings us to 9/11. I mean, you could argue it's the biggest intelligence failure, in recent history.
It's a tragedy, that's for sure. And it's still debated to this day. Could it have been prevented? That's a really tough question. There are good arguments on both sides. Some people say, there were clear patterns that were missed. They point to specific intelligence reports that, in hindsight, seem to foreshadow the attacks.
Right, like that memo from the FBI guy in Phoenix.
Yeah.
Right, the one who was warning about bin Laden sending students to flight schools in the U.S.
Exactly. Or the fact that the CIA knew 2 of the hijackers were in the country, but they didn't tell the FBI. And then there's that intercepted phone call, remember, between those al-Qaeda guys. One of them talked about a surprise attack. It's easy to look back now and say, well, those were huge red flags. But at the time, there were just a few signals among, a million other things.
And that's the real challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Filtering out all the noise, finding the few bits of information that actually matter.
It's incredibly hard, that's for sure. Like the The bombing of that U.S. embassy in Kenya back in 1998, there were reports about a possible attack, right? But there were also a ton of other threats at the time, things that never happened. How do you decide which ones to take seriously when you're constantly being bombarded with this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, even that phone call you mentioned,
Yeah,
as creepy as it seems now, it was still super vague. No date, no place, no specific target.
that's the thing. Intelligence, it's rarely, crystal clear. It's usually bits and pieces, open to interpretation. Sometimes it can even be misleading. But the thing is, even when you think you have the full picture, you can still misinterpret it, like with the Yom Kippur War. And on the other hand, you can have something that seems really compelling, like that phone call, and it doesn't actually tell you that much.
So it seems like intelligence analysis is not just about like gathering information and figuring out what it means. It's also about, understanding what the information doesn't tell you, what its limitations are.
You got it. And that brings us to another really interesting aspect of, human behavior under stress, the difference between choking and panicking.
Ooh, okay. Now this is where it gets really interesting for me. It's like, there are different ways to fail, right? And they're not always what you'd expect.
Right. Gladwell, he uses some great examples to illustrate this. Remember Amanda Morphew, the scuba diver? Super experienced, almost drowned because she just blanked on her basic training when she was under stress. Panic took over. She reverted to instinct. Too little thinking,
Oh,
basically.
I know that feeling, that like freezing up,
Yeah.
when the pressure's on, you just totally forget what you're supposed to do.
Happens to the best of us. But then you have a case like John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane crash. He was a good pilot, right?
Yeah.
But got disoriented in the haze and went into that fatal dive.
What's interesting is it seems like he was choking, not panicking.
What do you mean by that? Well, instead of relying on his training, and his instruments, he got fixated on trying to see those, the lights of Martha's Vineyard, familiar landmarks, right? He was thinking too much, overanalyzing the situation, lost precious time. In his case, you could argue that all his experience, his skill, it might have actually worked against him.
That's wow. So expertise doesn't always help you when things go wrong.
It's a strange thing. Choking, it often happens to the most skilled people when the pressure's on. They overthink, lose their flow, their intuition, and their performance suffers.
So what does prevent us from messing up in those situations, though? Can we, train ourselves to perform better under pressure?
That's a great question. And to answer it, we need to look at how pressure can affect us in ways we don't expect. Sometimes it undermines our abilities, even when we're really good at something.
We were talking about choking under pressure, and it got me thinking about something else in the book. It's like even, I don't know, subtle pressures, like those that come from stereotypes, right? Can actually really mess with how we perform.
You're talking about Claude Steele's work on stereotype threat. It's really fascinating stuff, and it shows you how powerful these unconscious biases can be, you know, especially when we're stressed out.
Yeah, I've heard the term, but I'm not sure I really get it. Could you maybe explain that a little bit?
Sure. So the basic idea is that when we're aware of these negative stereotypes about our group, right? Whether it's about race or gender or whatever, it creates this extra pressure. We worry about confirming those stereotypes, right? And that worry can actually make us perform worse, even if we're usually good at that thing.
Oh, so it's like, I don't know, like if someone says women are bad at math and then a woman has to take a math test, that stereotype could actually make her do worse, even if she's totally capable.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, Steele's research shows this happening with tons of different groups and situations, like Black students doing worse on standardized tests when they're told the test measures intelligence, or women doing worse on math tests when they're reminded about, stereotypes about women in math. It's a real thing. There was even a study where white students jumped lower in a physical test when they were being watched by a Black instructor.
It's kind of wild how these little things, these subtle cues, can have such a big impact on us, huh? I mean, it really shows you how much our environment, our social environment, can affect us, often without us even knowing it.
And it just goes back to that idea that experience and expertise don't always protect us from, messing up. Pressure can come from all kinds of places, especially that pressure to prove those negative stereotypes wrong. It can affect even the best of us.
It's a scary thought, honestly.
Yeah.
It makes me think about another high-pressure situation that Gladwell talks about, the Challenger disaster. People often say it was, an engineering failure or a management failure. But there's a sociologist, Diane Vaughan, who has a really interesting take on it in her book. It's called The Challenger Launch Decision.
Oh, yeah, she's the one who says it was a normal accident. Right. That's a term from another sociologist, Charles Perrow. It describes these huge disasters that happen, not because someone was careless or did something wrong, but just because systems are so complex.
So it's like, what? A bunch of small failures that happen to come together at the same time, and boom, you have a major disaster.
Yeah, kind of like a perfect storm. Like, think about the Apollo 13 mission. All those little things went wrong, right?
Yeah.
None of them seemed that serious on their own, but together they created a really dangerous situation. It wasn't one big mistake, it was a bunch of small things that interacted in a way that, no one could have predicted.
Right. Okay. But what about the Challenger? Was it just a normal accident, or was there something, I don't know, more specific going on?
Well, Vaughn argues that the O-ring issue, the cold weather that day, and the fact that they decided to launch, even though some engineers were saying it was too risky, all of that, she says, was part of a bigger pattern at NASA. She thinks they had gotten so used to dealing with, technical problems and anomalies that they started to see those deviations from safety protocols as normal.
So they were like, what's the word, complacent. They got so used to things going wrong that they didn't see the risk anymore.
In a way, yeah. And what's really scary is that, according to Vaughn, accidents like this might just be unavoidable in these really complex systems. Even if you have super strict safety procedures, you can't plan for every possibility, every combination of human error and technical glitches.
That's kind of a humbling thought, isn't it? I mean, we like to think we're in control, that we can build things to be, foolproof. But it's like these systems sometimes have a mind of their own.
It's true. It's the paradox of complexity. And even if we can't prevent every accident, we can at least learn from them, right? Well, Vaughn's analysis gets even more interesting here. She suggests that even those big investigations after a disaster, the reports, the recommendations, she says all that might be more about making us feel better than actually learning something.
That's a really interesting point. We go through all this effort to figure out why something went wrong, but what if we're just kidding ourselves? What if the real reasons are just, like, too complicated, too deep in the system itself for us to ever really understand?
It makes you think, right? And it brings us back to those main ideas we've been talking about, how complex modern systems are, how limited our judgment can be, all the different ways we can screw up, and how hard it is to actually learn from our mistakes.
This has been a really great conversation. Eye-opening, to say the least. It's definitely given me, and I'm sure our listeners too, a lot to think about, like how we make sense of the world and deal with all the crazy complexity around us. Any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
I think in a world that's becoming more and more reliant on complex systems, where we're constantly bombarded with information and where we're all vulnerable to biases and pressures, being able to make smart judgments is more important than ever. And as we've seen, expertise isn't always enough. Pictures can lie, and even when we try our best to learn from disasters, we might still be missing something. But that doesn't mean we should give up. By recognizing these limitations, by being aware of the traps we can fall into, we can start to make better decisions.
I like that. So where do we go from here? How do we get better at making judgments when everything's so complicated?
That's the million-dollar point, isn't it? But here's what I would say. Don't be afraid to question things, to challenge the status quo, and try to look beyond the obvious. Remember, always ask why, not just what. And most importantly, stay curious. There's always something new to learn, always more dots to connect.
Well said. This deep dive may be over, but the learning never stops. Thanks for joining us, everyone.